Our example says, suppose a researcher wants to see whether there is a relationship between the number of hours a student spends studying and the score he or she makes on an exam. The researcher selects a random sample of students and obtains the following results. In order to display the data using a scatter plot, we must first decide which variable is the independent variable, or the x, and which variable is the dependent variable, or the y. Remember that the independent variable is the one that you have more control over. A student has control over the number of hours they spend studying. So I'm going to call this my x. The exam score tends to depend on the number of hours studied. So I'll call this my dependent variable, and this will be my y. You will see in many of the homework problems that this designation is already made for you, that one of the variables is labeled x and one of them is labeled y. Now, for my x's, since my lowest x value is 1 and my largest x value is 6, it's going to make sense to simply count by ones across the x-axis on our graph. So I'm going to space out my tick marks. And it's customary to go a little bit beyond your lowest value, so I'm going to go to 7. I'm sorry, a little beyond your highest value, so I'm going to go to 7. All right, and then we're going to put a label down here. We're going to label this just like the chart has. We're going to say number of hours spent studying. Now we want to do the same thing on our y-axis. So our lowest y value is 57, and our highest y value is 88. And so you want to determine a scale that you could use to count this off. You do not have to start at 0. So if my lowest value is 57, I might start at 55. And maybe I decide to count up by 5s. And so since my highest value is 88, I can stop when I get to 90. All right, and let's also put in a label here. We'll call these exam scores, just like the chart tells us. And then we're ready to draw our graph. Now, a scatter plot is just a graph of points. So you want to plot a point for student A. Student A studied 6 hours, so I'm going to go to the 6 on the x-axis, and I'm going to go up to 82. And I'm going to place a point. And student B studied 2 hours, so I'm going to go above the 2 and go up to 63. Student C studied 1 hour and made a 57. Student D studied 5 hours and made an 88. Student E studied 2 hours and made a 68. And finally, the last student studied 3 hours and made a 75. And so we now have constructed a scatter plot. Now, the other part of this problem is going to be being able to interpret the relationship and whether or not it exists between your two variables by looking at your scatter plot. So you should be prepared for a series of questions. One question is, does the scatter plot represent what we call a linear or a nonlinear relationship? Now remember that the word linear means a line. It does not necessarily mean that the points line up in a perfectly straight line, but just that they have that sort of linear straight path to them. For example, if you were to think about this as being like a walking path in the park, and if this were your path is straight and all the points are on that path. So this tells me that this is a linear progression for the points. Nonlinear simply means that there is no pattern discernible on the graph. It is simply that the points are scattered all over the place. The second question that's going to be asked is, assuming it's linear, does it represent a positive or a negative relationship? And this is simply found by looking at the direction that your points are moving in. Since our points here are moving from the bottom left of the graph to the top right, then this is going to be a positive relationship. And then the final thing that you're going to be asked to do is to kind of write a conclusion statement based on your actual variables. These conclusion statements typically start with the x value and have that increase. So your statement would begin, and we would say something like, as the number of hours studied increases, and then you would ask yourself what is happening to the y value. So as the number of hours studied increases, the y value, or the exam scores, they're going to increase as well. So again, keep in mind that when you're asked to interpret from a scatter plot, these are the three things that you want to talk about. Is it linear or nonlinear? Is the relationship positive or negative? And then some sort of concluding statement that starts as your x value increases, what happens to your y value?